everyone. I'm Trevor Hanson, and welcome to Talking Transpo. I created this YouTube channel a number of years ago with the thought that at some point I would use it to talk about transportation issues and things I thought people might find interesting about transportation. I teach transportation engineering and planning at the University of New Brunswick, and it's a topic that has fascinated me for as long as I can remember. There is some really important work going on at our university that deals with transportation issues in New Brunswick, with the idea that what we learn here can be something applied elsewhere in the world to solve problems there. So come with me as I take you through a research paper today that I think you might find interesting. So the presentation I'm going to show you here is just going to take some slides from that paper that I presented in Washington that was written by me and my former graduate student, Matthew Goodrow. And we worked with 7 volunteer driver programs in New Brunswick. When we think of transportation for people in rural areas, you either drive yourself or you may have a friend and family to help you. But some people may not have friends and family available when they need them, and other people may not be able to travel independently. This is a slide from the Independent Transportation Network. It's an example of a volunteer transportation program. So a program like this, where it uses volunteer drivers using their own vehicle who are paid mileage to take people who are members of this organization to wherever they need to go. And we actually have several, maybe close to a dozen now, that operate in various parts of New Brunswick. At the time I started this research, there was about 7. And the question is, well, how do you make something like this work in places where it doesn't currently operate? It seems like it should be pretty simple, but it's not. So when we look at some of the major issues that we're facing these programs in New Brunswick, it's that we had some really good examples of programs that were very effective, but we couldn't seem to replicate them elsewhere. So if you're trying to start something, whether you're going to try to build a house or whether you're going to look at getting a new car, you have to do some pre-planning. You have to estimate how much you're going to need. And that's a real challenge when we don't have the tools to be able to do that for volunteer driving programs. Like, how do we use our transportation planning tools to understand rural volunteer transport? And we did it by treating the programs as a mode of transport. So what is a mode of transportation? Think of it as your car, think of flying, think of using a train. Those are each different modes of transportation. So even though a volunteer transportation program uses a car, it's set up differently than driving yourself. It's set up differently than a taxi. It's set up differently than transit. So how do we treat this differently? We worked with several groups, and we had to kind of get everybody who were collecting information, collecting it in a way where you could put it all together and learn something. So that meant coming to a common data collection standard. And it took about a year. And again, our friends who are in the volunteer programs, we really thank them for their efforts in helping us out here. And to Matthew Goodrow, who was my former student, who spent his master's thesis working on this. But think about, in a normal time, the kind of travel that you would make, and how would you turn that into a number? So think about it. Well, maybe you have to pick up someone and go to the doctor, the grocery store, the pharmacy, the bank, and then back home again. How do you measure that? So Benedict is someone, I picked this name because I gave this presentation to a group in Germany recently, including a student who visited from Germany whose name was Benedict, and so I thought I'd put his name in here. So you leave from home, you go to the doctor, you go to the grocery store, you go to the pharmacy, you go to the bank, and then back home again. How do we turn that into a number? Well, what we have here is every time someone stopped, go to the hospital, it's 1 trip, 2 trips, 3 trips, 4 trips, and back home. 5 total trips. Our volunteer driver partners would call that each of these stops. So every time the vehicle stopped to do a task, they counted that. So we had 5 total stops here. Now, completely altogether, we would call that a trip chain because all of these are connected for us to get back home again. But we ended up calling this a drive. So anytime someone provided all these stops to someone and then returned them back home again and were free to serve other clients, it was called a drive. So that's how we turned travel activity into a number. So what did we learn after a year of data collection? With 7 groups who served each, on average, a service area of about 1,800 kilometers. So think of it as driving basically almost Fredericton to Moncton and then 10 kilometers on either side of it. That's their approximate service area. So they're dealing with a fairly large area each of these. So it's just showing the amount of transport that are being provided by these groups. And the average population was about 23,000. So again, that's about the size of Carleton County, about the size of Charlotte County. And on average, for the total number of the 7 groups, they did 5,700 drives. So what does that mean? Well, going back to our slide here, that was 5,700 times where they took somebody around to do something and brought them back home again. On average, it worked out to about 824 per group. Again, this may not compare when we think of large transit services or airports where hundreds of thousands of people are going through, but this matters to people who use these programs, and they haven't been measured like this before. This was an interesting number that we came up with. We took the approximate service area and the population in that service area, and then did drives and divided it by the number per 1,000 population. Now, this was an average for all the groups. The idea of this number was, could we take, if we knew that there was 20,000 people in a particular area, could we then multiply this number by the population and get the number of drives as a measure of feasibility? We haven't tried that yet. We just have these numbers as a starting point. And then the groups did 9,000 stops. So 5,000 times they took people out and about, and then within those 5,000 times they stopped 9,000. And on average, about 2 times for every drive they stopped. And actually, while a lot of these programs are targeted for older adults, about 50% or so of the users are age 65 and older. So there are younger people that are relying on these programs to meet their needs, as well as older adults who maybe, again, aren't owning their vehicle now or looking to transition to be a passenger. So within the 1 year, the 7 groups drove over 300,000 kilometers. And look at this, on average, 61 kilometers per drive. So think about that, and 39 kilometers per stop. So it's just telling you that the rural nature of these programs that are delivering this much transportation, on average, that people have to go that far to meet their needs. And approximately 8,367 users. Now, that's not unique users. So it's the same way when you go to the airport and they count total passengers. You may have gone to the airport 5 times or 50 times, but it's not unique users. It's the number of people that were transported. So some people may have taken 10 trips during the year or 20. But on average, you can see here that there is some carpooling going on, 1.5 users for every drive. So what does this all work out to? About 360 unique users, 700 or more members, 9 paid staff, and 117 volunteers in our sample of 7 groups. That's quite a contribution when you think about delivering that type of transportation. So what do people use? So we broke these data up for a year in terms of small and medium-sized groups. So that's between fewer than 100 members, and large groups, which were 100 to 300 members. If we look at total number of stops, for large groups, look at the number of stops for health purposes. It's way more than the rest of these categories: work and education, life maintenance, quality of life, showing that the use of these programs to help people who can't get to health facilities, again, they did quite a large proportion of their overall trips, but almost 2,000, over 2,000 were for health. For the small and medium-sized groups, you see that there's a more of an emphasis on life maintenance. That's like going, getting your groceries, going to the bank, followed by health, followed by quality of life. Quality of life is like social trips, going out to see a friend, and work and education were a little smaller. It's more of a function sometimes of the need of the program and the users. Stops home. So after doing all these stops, they had to come back home again. So that's why these values are so high, is because they had to bring people back. This tells us just how busy each of the programs are, large groups and small groups, by time of year. So you can see that in January is the least busy for the small and medium-sized group, increasing and getting busier over the summer months and back down to winter, while for larger groups, they were busier over the winter months and into spring, and then kind of flattening out. That's an interesting finding. Why do you think that might be? Could it be because some people don't want to drive in the winter and that's going up higher here? But then again, maybe some volunteers don't want to drive in the winter either. This is biweekly data. So nobody was driving on Saturday or Sunday really, because those were a couple trips there. But most of the operations were Monday to Friday. And look at the large groups. They're pretty even throughout the week. For the smaller groups, they were much busier coming into Thursday and Friday. Even during the day, because they were giving us time of day when trips took place, the dark line is the large groups. So you can see earlier in the morning, there's a lot of travel, and then not so much, and then busier around lunchtime, back home for lunch, out again, busier around the end of the day, and then busier when it comes to the end of the service day. And what about volunteers? The amount of time that people are spending to support their programs is incredible. This is just from our data, but there are data that talk about volunteers on a national basis. But we were able to get information about, well, how many total drivers for each program, how many hours did they put in, how many drives did they provide, and look at this. If you're a volunteer, look what you can expect to do. 12 hours, 12 drives per volunteer if you're in the small group, and 71 drives for the large group. We have some real active volunteers here. And but in the smaller group, they're putting more time in on a per drive basis, but overall, the larger groups are putting in much more time. These groups are starting small. You don't need to set up a massive program to get started. That's what I'm taking away from these data. So when we think about how we can use this information, I like to think of it as that these kind of tools, using transportation to help us understand how much people use transportation, can help us then plan and forecast for their use. I hope you found this an interesting look at one of the research papers, and I hope to do this again soon on another research paper. Thanks for your attention.